The moment her brother Marcus slammed his fist on the mahogany table and declared, "We need Daniel's help," Sarah watched 23 years of family skepticism crumble in real time. The same Daniel they had dismissed as a gold digger, the same Daniel they claimed was using their precious daughter for her inheritance, the same Daniel who now held their family's financial future in his capable lawyer hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had always known she was different from the rest of her family. At 31, she possessed a quiet strength that stood in stark contrast to her family's dramatic tendencies and their obsession with appearances. Growing up in the affluent suburb of Westfield Heights outside Chicago, she had watched her parents, Robert and Catherine Mitchell, navigate their social circle with calculated precision. Every dinner party, every charity gala, every family decision was made with one question in mind: what would people think? Her younger brother Marcus, now 28, had inherited their parents' flair for the theatrical. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, a job that suited his natural charisma and his ability to charm his way through any situation. Her sister Elena, 25, was pursuing her master's degree in art history while simultaneously planning her elaborate wedding to her college sweetheart. Both siblings had always fallen perfectly in line with their parents' expectations. Sarah, however, had chosen a different path. After graduating with honors from Northwestern University with a degree in social work, she had dedicated her life to helping families in crisis. She worked for the Cook County Department of Children and Family Services, a job that paid modestly but fulfilled her in ways her family never quite understood. While Marcus closed million-dollar sales deals and Elena curated gallery exhibitions, Sarah spent her days ensuring children had safe homes and families received the support they needed. The Mitchell family's wealth came from Robert's successful construction company, Mitchell and Associates, which had built half the commercial developments in the western suburbs over the past 3 decades. Catherine came from old money, her grandfather having founded a small bank that eventually became part of a larger financial institution. Together, they had created a comfortable life for their children, complete with private schools, European vacations, and trust funds that would ensure none of their children would ever want for anything. But with that comfort came expectations. The Mitchell children were expected to marry within their social circle, pursue prestigious careers, and maintain the family's reputation in the community. Marcus had mostly complied, dating the daughters of country club members and business associates. Elena had chosen perfectly, falling in love with the son of a federal judge. Sarah, as usual, had gone her own way. She met Daniel Rodriguez at a continuing education conference for legal professionals and social workers. He was 34, a senior associate at a mid-sized law firm specializing in family law and employment disputes. Unlike the men her family typically approved of, Daniel hadn't grown up with privilege. His parents had immigrated from El Salvador when he was 5 years old. His father worked construction, his mother cleaned office buildings at night. Daniel had earned his way through community college, then transferred to the University of Illinois, and finally graduated from law school through a combination of scholarships, student loans, and working full-time. When Sarah first saw Daniel presenting a workshop on custody mediation, she was struck by his quiet competence and genuine compassion for the families caught in legal battles. He spoke about the law not as an abstract concept, but as a tool for protecting vulnerable people. During the lunch break, she approached him to ask about a case she was struggling with. Their professional conversation lasted 15 minutes. Their coffee date the following week lasted 4 hours. For 3 months, Sarah kept Daniel separate from her family life. She knew instinctively that they would find reasons to disapprove, and she wanted to protect what was growing between them. Daniel understood. He had met enough privileged families through his legal work to recognize the dynamics at play. He never pressured Sarah to introduce him or complained about being kept separate from that part of her life. The inevitable meeting came at Marcus's birthday party, a lavish affair at the country club with 50 guests and an open bar. Sarah had planned to attend alone, but when Daniel finished a court hearing early, she impulsively invited him to join her. She realized her mistake the moment they walked through the club's ornate doors together. Her mother's smile faltered when Sarah introduced Daniel. Her father's handshake was perfunctory, his eyes immediately assessing Daniel's off-the-rack suit and modest watch. Marcus was polite but distant, clearly more interested in the daughter of his father's business partner who had arrived wearing a designer dress that cost more than Daniel made in a month. The evening was a study in subtle social rejection. Daniel was seated at the far end of the table during dinner, next to elderly relatives who monopolized the conversation with stories about their recent cruise. When he tried to engage others in conversation, responses were brief and polite before attention turned elsewhere. Sarah watched it all, her cheeks burning with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. The real test came when Robert Mitchell cornered Daniel near the bar. Sarah was across the room, but she could see her father's body language, the way he leaned in slightly, his expression serious. Later, Daniel would tell her about the conversation. "So, Daniel," Robert had said, his tone carefully neutral, "Sarah tells me you're a lawyer. What kind of law do you practice?" "Family law primarily, custody disputes, divorce proceedings, some employment cases. I focus on helping people navigate difficult transitions in their lives." Robert had nodded, but his expression suggested he found the answer lacking. "That's admirable work, I'm sure. Not particularly lucrative, though. Have you given any thought to corporate law, business litigation? That's where the real opportunities are." Daniel had smiled politely. "I'm sure you're right, Mr. Mitchell, but I find fulfillment in the work I do. Making a difference for families in crisis feels more valuable to me than maximizing billable hours." It was the wrong answer. Robert Mitchell valued ambition, drive, and most importantly, the kind of success that could be measured in dollars and social status. Daniel's commitment to public service work struck him as either naive or lazy. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Robert probing about Daniel's background, his family, his long-term career plans. By the time Sarah made her way over to them, the damage was done. She could see it in her father's eyes, the way he had already categorized Daniel as unsuitable. The ride home was quiet. Daniel stared out the passenger window while Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. Finally, he spoke. "They think I'm after your money." It wasn't a question. Sarah wanted to deny it, but they both knew the truth. Her family's wealth wasn't something she talked about or flaunted, but it was always there, an invisible presence that influenced how people saw her and how she moved through the world. "My family is complicated," she said finally. Daniel reached over and squeezed her hand. "All families are complicated, but yours is also wealthy, and that makes people suspicious of outsiders like me." Over the following months, Sarah's family made their feelings increasingly clear. Not through direct confrontation, which would have been undignified, but through 1,000 small slights and pointed comments. When Sarah brought Daniel to Sunday dinner, her mother would serve meals that highlighted their different backgrounds, elaborate dishes with unfamiliar ingredients that Daniel had never encountered. When conversation turned to travel, Marcus would regale the table with stories about expensive European vacations, always making sure to mention the cost of hotels and restaurants. Elena was perhaps the most cutting in her subtle disapproval. She would make comments about how important it was to be with someone who shared your values and background. During one particularly painful dinner, she launched into a monologue about her fiancé's family connections and how wonderful it was to be with someone who understood her world. "It's just so much easier," Elena had said, her eyes meeting Sarah's across the table, "when you don't have to explain everything. When your partner already understands your references, your experiences, your expectations for the future." Daniel, to his credit, never responded to these provocations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He maintained his quiet dignity, answered questions politely, and tried to find common ground with Sarah's family. But Sarah could see the toll it was taking. The man who was confident and articulate in court, who could command the respect of judges and opposing counsel, became increasingly quiet in her family's presence. The breaking point came at Christmas dinner during their second year of dating. The family had gathered at Robert and Catherine's sprawling colonial home, the dining room decorated with fresh flowers and expensive china. Daniel had brought thoughtful gifts for everyone, a rare book about Chicago architecture for Robert, a silk scarf from a local artist for Catherine, carefully chosen presents that reflected genuine thought and consideration. The gifts were received politely, but without enthusiasm. When it came time for the family to exchange presents among themselves, Sarah watched in horror as her parents presented Marcus with a check for $25,000 toward a new car and Elena with a matching amount for her wedding expenses. Sarah received a smaller check and a pointed comment about how they hoped she would use it wisely. Daniel said nothing, but she could see the muscle in his jaw working. The message was clear: we take care of our own, and you're not one of us. That night, as they lay in bed in Sarah's apartment, Daniel finally voiced what they both knew. They're never going to accept me. Sarah turned to face him in the darkness. Does it matter what they think? It matters because they're your family. It matters because you're going to inherit a significant amount of money someday, and they think I'm with you because of that. Are you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Daniel was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I make $38,000 a year helping families stay together. I drive a 12-year-old Honda Civic and live in a one-bedroom apartment that I share with a roommate. Your parents spend more on a weekend vacation than I make in 3 months. Do you really think I'm not aware of the financial difference between us? That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. He turned to look at her, his eyes serious in the dim light. I fell in love with a woman who dedicates her life to helping children. I fell in love with someone who chooses difficult work because it matters, not because it pays well. I fell in love with your heart, your integrity, your strength. The fact that you happen to come from wealth is something I have to navigate, not something I'm trying to exploit. They were married 8 months later in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with just 2 friends as witnesses. Sarah's family was invited, but chose not to attend, claiming they couldn't support a marriage they felt was doomed to fail. Robert Mitchell made one last attempt to dissuade his daughter, taking her to lunch the week before the wedding. I just want you to be happy, sweetheart, he had said, cutting his expensive steak with surgical precision. And I'm worried that Daniel doesn't understand the responsibilities that come with our family's position in the community. What responsibilities? Sarah had asked. Maintaining certain standards, supporting the right causes, being involved with the right organizations. These things matter for the business, for our reputation. Sarah had set down her fork and looked directly at her father. Dad, Daniel spends his days helping families who have nothing. He volunteers at legal aid clinics on weekends. He tutors underprivileged kids in math and English. If those aren't the right causes, then I don't know what are. Robert had shifted uncomfortably. That's not what I mean, and you know it. But Sarah had already made her choice. She married Daniel Rodriguez on a Tuesday afternoon in October, wearing a simple blue dress she had bought off the rack. Her parents sent a card, but no gift. Marcus texted congratulations 3 days later. Elena sent nothing at all. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, not because of any problems between Sarah and Daniel, but because of the ongoing tension with her family. Holiday invitations became less frequent. Sunday dinners stopped including her unless she came alone. When she and Daniel bought a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood, her parents' response was lukewarm at best. It's very nice, dear, Catherine had said during her single visit to their home, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Very cozy. The house was indeed modest compared to the Mitchell family standards, a small 2-bedroom bungalow with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that needed updating. But it was theirs, purchased with their combined savings and a mortgage they could afford on their public service salaries. Daniel had spent weekends repairing the front porch and painting the living room, while Sarah planted a small garden in the backyard. It was the first time in her life she had lived somewhere that felt truly hers. Daniel's integration into her extended family was equally challenging. At the few family gatherings they attended, he remained polite but increasingly distant. He would answer direct questions, but rarely volunteered information about his work or his life. Sarah could see him building walls, protecting himself from the subtle rejections and condescending comments that seemed to follow him wherever he went with her family. The situation reached a new low during Elena's wedding, a lavish affair at one of Chicago's most exclusive hotels. Sarah had been asked to be a bridesmaid, a role that came with significant financial obligations, An expensive dress, multiple pre-wedding events, a substantial gift. Daniel had encouraged her to participate, despite the cost, understanding how important the relationship with her sister was to Sarah. At the reception, Daniel was seated at a table with distant relatives and family friends, far from the head table where Sarah sat with the other bridesmaids. During the dancing portion of the evening, he spent most of the time alone, nursing a single beer and watching Sarah fulfill her bridesmaid duties. The moment that crystallized everything happened during the father-daughter dance. Robert Mitchell took the microphone to make a toast, his voice carrying across the elegant ballroom. "Elena has chosen wisely in Thomas," he declared, his arm around his new son-in-law. "She's found a partner who understands her, who shares her values, who can provide for her in the manner she deserves. They're going to build a beautiful life together, surrounded by family who supports their union." The words weren't directed at Sarah and Daniel, but everyone in the room understood the subtext. Elena had made the right choice. Sarah, by implication, had not. That night, driving home from the wedding, Sarah finally lost her composure. "I'm so tired of this," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm tired of them treating you like you're not good enough. I'm tired of pretending it doesn't matter." Daniel pulled over to the side of the road and held her while she cried. When she had composed herself, he spoke quietly. "Maybe we should just accept that this is how it's going to be. Your family has made their position clear. Fighting it is only hurting you." "But it's not fair." "No," he agreed, "it's not. But fair and reality are two different things." From that point forward, Sarah began to distance herself from her family. She still loved them, but she was no longer willing to subject herself and Daniel to their disapproval. Holiday visits became shorter and less frequent. She stopped calling her mother every week. She declined invitations to family gatherings unless they were for truly significant occasions. The distance was painful, but also liberating. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah felt free to build the life she wanted without constantly measuring it against her family's expectations. She and Daniel settled into a comfortable routine, both finding fulfillment in their work and in each other. Daniel's career began to flourish during their third year of marriage. His reputation for thorough preparation and genuine compassion for his clients had spread throughout the legal community. He was promoted to senior associate at his firm and began handling more complex cases. More importantly, he had found his niche in employment law, particularly cases involving workplace discrimination and wrongful termination. Sarah watched with pride as Daniel's confidence returned. Away from her family's judgment, he was able to be himself, intelligent, passionate, dedicated to justice. His colleagues respected him, his clients trusted him. The man who had been made to feel small in her family's presence was actually quite formidable in his professional environment. It was during this period of growing independence that the first crack appeared in the Mitchell family's armor. Marcus, who had always seemed to glide effortlessly through life, ran into serious trouble at work. The pharmaceutical company he worked for was under investigation for illegal marketing practices, and Marcus, as one of their top salespeople, had been swept up in the probe. Sarah learned about the situation through a panicked phone call from her mother. "Marcus needs a lawyer," Catherine said without preamble. "A good one. This whole thing is ridiculous, but he needs someone who can make it go away." Sarah's first instinct was to offer Daniel's help, but she caught herself. Her family had spent 3 years making it clear that Daniel wasn't good enough for them. She wasn't about to volunteer his services now that they needed something. "There are lots of good lawyers in Chicago, Mom," she said carefully. "Yes, but we don't know any criminal lawyers, and this whole thing is so complicated. Marcus says they're claiming he knew about some kind of illegal marketing scheme, but he was just doing his job." Sarah felt a familiar tension building in her chest. "What kind of evidence do they have?" "I don't know all the details," Catherine admitted, "but apparently there are emails and recorded phone calls. It's all very overwhelming." Despite her frustration with her family, Sarah found herself wanting to help. Marcus, for all his faults, was still her brother, but she also knew that any offer of assistance would have to come with conditions. "If you want Daniel's advice," she said finally, "you're going to have to ask him yourself, and you're going to have to treat him with respect." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I don't think that's necessary, dear. Surely there are other options." "I'm sure there are," Sarah agreed, "but Daniel specializes in employment law and federal investigations. He's exactly the kind of lawyer Marcus needs." Another pause. "We'll think about it." Catherine hung up without saying goodbye, and Sarah didn't hear from her family for 2 weeks. When her phone finally rang again, it was her father. "Sarah, we need to talk," Robert said, his voice strained. "Can you and Daniel meet us for dinner this weekend?" The request was unprecedented. In 3 years of marriage, Robert had never voluntarily asked to spend time with Daniel. Something significant had changed. They met at a restaurant downtown, neutral territory that belonged to none of them. Robert and Catherine arrived looking haggard, their usual polished appearance somewhat diminished. They ordered drinks before getting to the point. "Marcus's situation has gotten worse," Robert began. "The federal prosecutors are talking about filing formal charges. They're claiming he was part of a conspiracy to market drugs for unapproved uses." Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. Sarah could see him shifting into lawyer mode, analyzing the information being presented. "What kind of evidence do they have?" Daniel asked. Robert looked uncomfortable. "Email chains, recorded sales calls, documentation of payments to doctors for speaking engagements that might not have been legitimate." "How involved was Marcus in the decision-making process for these marketing strategies?" "That's just it," Catherine interjected. "He wasn't involved in decisions. He was just following the protocols his supervisors gave him." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That could be a strong defense, depending on how well documented those protocols are and whether Marcus raised any concerns about potentially problematic practices." "So you think you could help him?" Robert asked, his tone carefully. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see him considering not just the legal aspects of the case, but the personal dynamics at play. "I'd need to review all the evidence and speak with Marcus directly," he said finally. "Federal employment cases are complex, and there are a lot of factors to consider." "Of course," Robert agreed quickly, "whatever you need." It was a start, but Sarah could sense the underlying tension. Her parents needed Daniel's help, but they were still struggling to accept him as an equal. The dinner ended with tentative plans for Daniel to meet with Marcus the following week. As they drove home, Sarah felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. This could be the opportunity for her family to finally see Daniel for who he really was. But it could also be another chance for them to disappoint her. "Are you sure you want to take this on?" she asked as they pulled into their driveway. Daniel turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment. "Your brother is facing serious federal charges. If I can help him, I should." "Even after the way they've treated you?" "Especially because of how they've treated me," he said. "This is a chance to show them who I really am, not who they think I am." Sarah reached over and took his hand. "And if they still don't get it?" Daniel smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. "Then at least we'll know we tried." The meeting between Daniel and Marcus took place the following Tuesday at Daniel's law office. Sarah wasn't present, but Daniel filled her in afterward. Marcus had been defensive at first, insisting that he had done nothing wrong and that the whole investigation was a misunderstanding. But as Daniel walked him through the evidence, Marcus began to realize the seriousness of his situation. "He's scared," Daniel told Sarah that evening, "and he should be. The prosecution has a strong case if they can prove he knew the marketing practices were illegal." "Did he know?" Daniel hesitated. "I think he suspected something wasn't right, but he chose not to ask questions. That's not necessarily criminal, but it's not a strong position to defend from either." Over the next several weeks, Daniel threw himself into Marcus's case with the same dedication he brought to all his work. He reviewed thousands of pages of documents, interviewed potential witnesses, and researched federal precedents for similar cases. Sarah watched him work long hours, preparing a defense that could potentially save her brother from years in prison. The transformation in her family's attitude was gradual but unmistakable. Robert began calling Daniel directly instead of going through Sarah. Catherine started asking detailed questions about legal strategy, clearly impressed by Daniel's thoroughness and expertise. Even Elena, who had been the most openly dismissive of Daniel, began to show grudging respect for his efforts on Marcus's behalf. The breakthrough came when Daniel identified a crucial flaw in the prosecution's case. While reviewing internal company documents, he discovered evidence that Marcus had actually raised concerns about certain marketing practices with his supervisors, only to be told that the practices were legal and approved by the company's legal department. This changes everything, Daniel explained to the family during a strategy meeting at his office. If we can prove Marcus was acting in good faith based on guidance from company lawyers, we can argue he had no reason to believe his actions were illegal. Robert leaned forward in his chair, his expression intense. Can you prove it? The documentation is strong, Daniel replied, and I found two other employees who are willing to testify that Marcus raised similar concerns in team meetings. For the first time since the investigation began, Sarah saw hope in her parents' eyes. They were beginning to understand that Daniel wasn't just competent, he was excellent at what he did. The legal maneuvering continued for months. Daniel negotiated with federal prosecutors, filed motions to suppress evidence, and prepared for what could be a lengthy trial. Through it all, he kept the family informed, explaining complex legal concepts in terms they could understand and preparing them for various possible outcomes. The case never went to trial. 2 weeks before jury selection was scheduled to begin, the prosecutors offered a plea agreement that would allow Marcus to avoid prison time in exchange for cooperation with the ongoing investigation and agreement to pay substantial fines. Daniel advised accepting the deal, explaining that while Marcus maintained his innocence, the risks of going to trial were too great. The night after Marcus signed the plea agreement, Robert Mitchell called Daniel directly. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Several apologies, actually." Daniel was quiet, waiting for Robert to continue. "I judged you without knowing you," Robert went on. "I made assumptions based on your background, your income, your profession. I was wrong." It was more than Sarah had ever expected to hear from her father. When Daniel relayed the conversation to her, she felt a cautious optimism about the possibility of real change in their family dynamics. But the real test was yet to come. The Mitchell family was about to face a crisis that would require not just Daniel's legal expertise, but his complete commitment to their well-being. And this time, the stakes would be even higher than Marcus's criminal charges. The call came on a Thursday morning in November, just as Sarah was getting ready for work. Elena's voice was shaky and barely controlled. "Dad's been arrested," she said without any preamble. "They came to the house this morning with handcuffs and everything. Mom is hysterical." Sarah sank onto her bed, her mind racing. Arrested for what? Something about the business. Fraud, bribery, I don't know all the details. They searched the house, took boxes of documents, seized his computer. Sarah, what are we going to do? The irony wasn't lost on her. The family that had spent years questioning Daniel's worth was now facing their second major legal crisis in less than a year. And once again, they would need the help of the man they had dismissed as a gold digger. "Where's Dad now?" Sarah asked. "Downtown, being processed or whatever they call it. Mom tried to call the family lawyer, but he does estate planning and real estate. He said we need someone who specializes in federal criminal defense." Sarah closed her eyes. She knew what Elena was going to ask, and she knew what her answer would be. Despite years of hurt and rejection, she couldn't abandon her family when they needed her most. "I'll call Daniel," she said. "Thank you," Elena whispered. "I know we don't deserve his help, but thank you." Daniel was in court when Sarah called, but he returned her call within an hour. His response was immediate and unequivocal. "I'll handle whatever needs to be handled," he said simply. This could be bigger than Marcus's case. If Dad's really being charged with federal crimes related to his business, "Then your family is going to need the best defense possible," Daniel interrupted. "Let me make some calls." By the end of the day, Daniel had arranged for Robert's release on bail, connected the family with a bail bondsman, and began the process of reviewing the charges against her father. The allegations were serious: conspiracy to commit bribery, mail fraud, and tax evasion. If convicted, Robert Mitchell could face decades in federal prison. That evening, the entire Mitchell family gathered at Daniel and Sarah's small house for the first time since their wedding. Robert looked older than his 62 years, his usual confidence replaced by bewilderment and fear. Catherine sat beside him on the couch, holding his hand and dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Marcus and Elena sat across from them, both clearly shaken by this turn of events. The Golden family that had always seemed untouchable was facing the possibility of complete destruction. Daniel spread the charging documents across their dining room table, explaining each allegation in detail. The case centered on Robert's relationship with several city officials who had allegedly received payments and gifts in exchange for favorable treatment on construction contracts. The prosecution claims you systematically bribed public officials to secure contracts worth millions of dollars, Daniel explained, his tone professional but not unkind. Those weren't bribes, Robert protested. Those were legitimate business expenses. Golf outings, dinners, holiday gifts. That's how business gets done in this industry. Daniel nodded. I understand that's how you saw it, but the federal government has different standards for what constitutes bribery of public officials. We're going to need to examine every transaction, every relationship, every communication you had with these officials. Over the following days, the scope of the case became clear. The FBI had been investigating corruption in Chicago's construction industry for over 2 years. They had wiretapped phones, recorded conversations, and analyzed financial records going back a decade. Robert Mitchell's construction company was just one of several firms under investigation, but the evidence against him appeared to be substantial. Daniel threw himself into the case with even more intensity than he had shown with Marcus's situation. He hired additional staff, brought in experts on federal criminal law, and began building what would become a comprehensive defense strategy. The stress on the Mitchell family was enormous. Robert's construction company, once a cornerstone of the local business community, became radioactive overnight. Clients canceled contracts, suppliers demanded immediate payment, and employees began looking for other jobs. The family's social standing, so important to them for decades, evaporated almost instantly. Through it all, Daniel worked tirelessly on Robert's behalf. He challenged the government's evidence, questioned the credibility of cooperating witnesses, and fought to exclude wiretapped conversations that might have been obtained illegally. His dedication was total, despite years of rejection and condescension from the very people he was now trying to save. Sarah watched her husband work 18-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination. She also watched her family's attitude toward him transform completely. Robert, who had once questioned Daniel's ambition, now praised his work ethic. Catherine, who had worried about Daniel's background, now spoke admiringly of his integrity. Marcus and Elena, who had treated him as an outsider, now called him directly when they had questions or concerns. The transformation was most evident during family meetings at Daniel's office. Robert, who had once lectured Daniel about the importance of lucrative corporate work, now listened respectfully as Daniel explained complex legal strategies. Catherine, who had once served elaborate meals designed to highlight cultural differences, now insisted on bringing simple sandwiches to the office so Daniel wouldn't have to stop working to eat. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the family talked about Daniel when he wasn't present. Sarah overheard her mother on the phone with a friend describing Daniel as brilliant and dedicated. She heard Marcus telling someone that his brother-in-law was the best lawyer in Chicago. Elena, who had once suggested Sarah could do better, now spoke with pride about having a federal criminal defense attorney in the family. The case moved slowly through the federal system. Daniel filed motion after motion, challenging everything from the initial search warrant to the admissibility of recorded conversations. Each legal victory, no matter how small, was celebrated by the Mitchell family as evidence of Daniel's exceptional skill. The breakthrough came 8 months into the case, when Daniel discovered that one of the key witnesses against Robert had been given immunity in exchange for his testimony. More importantly, Daniel found evidence that this witness had lied to federal investigators about his own role in the alleged bribery scheme. If we can prove the witness perjured himself, Daniel explained to the family, it undermines the credibility of his entire testimony against Robert. Robert leaned forward in his chair, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in months. Can you prove it? Daniel smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him in weeks. I think I can. The perjury evidence was damaging enough to the prosecution's case that they agreed to enter into plea negotiations. Rather than face the possibility of a decades-long prison sentence, Robert could plead guilty to a single count of tax evasion and serve 2 years in federal prison. It's not perfect, Daniel explained during the family meeting where he presented the offer, but it's far better than the alternative. A guilty verdict on all counts could mean 15 to 20 years. Robert Mitchell, the man who had once questioned Daniel's competence and character, looked across the table at his son-in-law with something approaching reverence. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. "I think you should take the deal," Daniel replied. "2 years is manageable. Your family will be here when you get out. The business can be rebuilt." Robert nodded slowly, then did something Sarah had never seen him do before. He reached across the table and grasped Daniel's hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for saving my life." The plea hearing took place on a cold January morning. The entire Mitchell family was present in the federal courthouse, sitting in the front row behind Robert as he formally entered his guilty plea. Sarah watched her father, once the most proud and stubborn man she knew, admit his mistakes in front of a federal judge. But she also watched Daniel, the man her family had spent years dismissing, stand beside her father as his advocate and protector. The same Daniel they had claimed was using their daughter for money had just saved their family from complete destruction. After the hearing, as they stood outside the courthouse in the bitter Chicago wind, Robert Mitchell made a public admission that Sarah had never expected to hear. "I was wrong about you, Daniel," he said, his voice carrying across the courthouse steps. "I was wrong about everything. You're not just a good lawyer, you're a good man, and my daughter chose well." It was a moment of vindication that Sarah had waited years to witness, but as she looked at Daniel's face, she realized that his expression wasn't triumphant. It was sad. Later that evening, as they sat in their living room, Sarah asked him about it. "Aren't you happy that they finally see who you really are?" Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire he had built in their modest fireplace. "I'm glad I could help your family," he said finally, "but it saddens me that it took a crisis for them to see my value. For 3 years, they judged me based on my background and my income. Now they respect me because I saved them from disaster. But I'm the same person I was before." Sarah moved closer to him on the couch. "Maybe this is just the beginning. Maybe now things can be different." "Maybe," Daniel agreed, "but I'll never forget how they treated me when they thought I had nothing to offer them." The next few months brought significant changes to the Mitchell family dynamics. Robert began serving his sentence at a minimum security federal facility, where Daniel visited him regularly to discuss the ongoing efforts to rebuild the construction company. Catherine, who had never worked outside the home, took on a more active role in managing the family's finances and legal affairs. Marcus, sobered by his own brush with federal prosecution, left the pharmaceutical industry and started working for a nonprofit organization focused on healthcare access. Elena postponed her graduate studies to help manage the family's affairs while her father was incarcerated. And through it all, Daniel remained the family's anchor. He helped Catherine navigate the complex process of restructuring the construction company's debts. He advised Marcus on employment law issues at his new job. He even helped Elena understand the legal implications of some of her father's business decisions that continued to have ramifications. But perhaps most importantly, Daniel's relationship with Sarah deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated. The stress of the legal crises had tested their marriage, but it had also revealed the strength of their partnership. They had faced adversity together and emerged stronger. One evening in late spring, almost 2 years after Robert's arrest, Sarah found Daniel in their backyard garden, planting tomatoes in the small plot they had cultivated together. She watched him work, this man who had been dismissed by her family as inadequate, who had proven himself to be more valuable than any of them had imagined. The morning Sarah discovered her father's true financial situation, she realized that everything her family thought they knew about their wealth was built on carefully constructed lies. It was 6 months after Robert's sentencing, and Daniel had been reviewing financial documents related to the ongoing civil lawsuits against the construction company when he made the devastating discovery. "Sarah, you need to see this," Daniel called from his home office, his voice unusually tense. She found him surrounded by spreadsheets and legal documents, his laptop screen displaying bank records that painted a picture she hadn't been prepared for. The Mitchell family fortune, which had seemed so solid and permanent throughout her childhood, was largely an illusion. "Your father has been borrowing against future contracts to maintain his lifestyle for years," Daniel explained, pointing to a series of transactions on the screen. "The house, the cars, the country club memberships, even your trust funds, it's all been funded by increasingly risky financial arrangements." Sarah sank into the chair beside his desk, her mind struggling to process the information. What does this mean for Mom? For Marcus and Elena? Daniel's expression was grim. It means that when the civil lawsuits are settled, there's not going to be much left. Your mother could lose the house. The trust funds your father set up for all of you kids are going to be seized to pay creditors. The revelation that the family wealth was essentially non-existent should have vindicated Daniel completely. Here was proof that he hadn't married Sarah for money, because there was no money to marry into. But as Sarah watched her husband review the devastating financial records, she saw no satisfaction in his expression, only genuine concern for her family's welfare. "We have to tell them," Sarah said quietly. "I know, but maybe we should think about how to present this information. Your mother is already dealing with your father's incarceration. This could destroy her." It was so typical of Daniel to worry about Catherine's emotional well-being, despite years of cold treatment from her. Sarah felt a surge of love for this man who continued to put her family's needs above his own hurt feelings. They decided to tell the family together, gathering everyone at Catherine's house on a Sunday evening. The familiar colonial home looked the same as always, but Sarah now saw it differently, knowing that it represented not family stability, but mounting debt and false appearances. Marcus arrived first, looking healthier than he had since his legal troubles began. His work at the nonprofit had given him a sense of purpose that his pharmaceutical sales job had never provided. Elena came in shortly after, carrying her infant son, a new addition to the family that had brought some joy during the dark period of legal battles. Catherine served coffee and homemade cookies, maintaining the gracious hostess persona she had perfected over decades of entertaining. But Sarah could see the strain around her mother's eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured from the silver coffee service that would probably have to be sold. Daniel waited until everyone was settled before beginning his explanation. He was gentle but thorough, walking the family through the financial reality they faced. Robert's construction company owed millions to creditors and former clients who had sued for damages. The family's assets were not nearly enough to cover these obligations. "I don't understand," Catherine said, her voice small and confused. "Robert always said the business was doing well. We have the house, the investments." "The house has 3 mortgages against it," Daniel explained carefully. "The investment accounts have been depleted to cover business expenses. Your husband was essentially running a shell game, using new borrowing to pay old debts while maintaining the appearance of success." Marcus leaned forward, his face pale. "What about our trust funds? I was counting on that money for my kids' college expenses." Daniel's expression was compassionate but firm. "The trust funds will be dissolved to pay creditors. I'm sorry, but there's nothing left to preserve." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah watched her family absorb the reality that their comfortable lives were about to change dramatically. Elena was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where will Mom live? She can't afford to maintain this house on her own." It was a practical question that cut to the heart of their new reality. Catherine Mitchell, who had never held a job or managed her own finances, was facing the prospect of starting over at age 58. "We'll figure it out," Sarah said, reaching for her mother's hand. "You're not going through this alone." Over the next several weeks, Daniel worked tirelessly to minimize the damage to the Mitchell family's finances. He negotiated with creditors, structured payment plans that would allow Catherine to keep some of her personal possessions, and found buyers for assets that had to be liquidated. More importantly, he helped the family navigate the emotional and practical challenges of their dramatically reduced circumstances. When Catherine broke down crying over having to sell her wedding china, Daniel spent an hour helping her identify pieces with the most sentimental value that might be preserved. When Marcus worried about affording his children's private school tuition, Daniel researched scholarship programs and helped him complete the applications. The transformation in how the family treated Daniel was complete and permanent. Catherine, who had once questioned whether he was worthy of her daughter, now turned to him for advice on everything from insurance policies to job applications. Marcus and Elena, who had once excluded him from family conversations, now called him regularly for guidance and support. But it was Robert's reaction that surprised Sarah the most. During one of Daniel's visits to the federal facility where he was serving his sentence, Robert made an admission that revealed the depth of his earlier misjudgment. I kept waiting for you to cut and run, he told Daniel through the reinforced glass of the prison visiting room. When the legal bills started mounting, when the family lost everything, I thought for sure you'd convince Sarah to distance yourself from us. Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his response. Why would I do that? Because that's what a smart opportunist would do, Robert replied. Get out before the situation got worse. Protect yourself and Sarah from being dragged down with us. I'm not an opportunist, Robert. I never was. Robert nodded slowly. I know that now. But for years, I convinced myself that's what you were because it was easier than admitting I was wrong about you. The conversation continued for another hour, with Robert expressing regret not just for his financial crimes, but for the way he had treated Daniel. It was an apology years in the making, and while it couldn't undo the hurt he had caused, it represented a genuine acknowledgement of his mistakes. Meanwhile, Sarah was dealing with her own complex emotions about her family's situation. Part of her felt vindicated. Daniel's worth had been proven beyond any doubt, and her family's earlier treatment of him now looked petty and foolish. But she also felt guilty about experiencing any satisfaction while her family suffered. The practical challenges were enormous. Catherine had to sell the family home and move into a modest apartment. She also had to find employment for the first time in her adult life, eventually taking a position as a receptionist at a dental office. The woman who had once organized charity galas was now learning to use a computer system to schedule appointments. Marcus and Elena both had to make significant lifestyle adjustments. Marcus moved his family to a smaller house in a less expensive neighborhood. Elena had to abandon her plans for graduate school and take a full-time job to help support her growing family. The privileged life they had all taken for granted was gone. Through it all, Daniel remained a constant source of support and guidance. He helped Catherine understand her rights as a tenant when her new landlord tried to raise her rent illegally. He advised Marcus on employment law issues when his new boss at the nonprofit tried to pressure him into working unpaid overtime. He even helped Elena find affordable childcare so she could work full-time. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The man the Mitchell family had dismissed as a fortune hunter was now literally holding their family together during its darkest period. His legal expertise, his compassion, and his unwavering loyalty to Sarah had made him indispensable to people who had once questioned his motives. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. Watching her family's struggles and seeing Daniel's response to those struggles had given her a new perspective on what really mattered in life. The wealth she had grown up with, the social status her family had prized so highly, had proven to be as fragile as smoke. But the love she shared with Daniel, built on mutual respect and genuine affection, had only grown stronger under pressure. One evening, as they sat in their modest living room, reviewing legal documents related to yet another aspect of her family's financial collapse, Sarah looked at her husband with new appreciation.
Do you ever regret marrying into such a complicated family? She asked. Daniel looked up from the documents he was studying. Never. Your family's complications don't define you, Sarah, and helping them through this crisis has actually been rewarding in its own way. Even after everything they put you through, especially because of what they put me through. It would have been easy to walk away and let them deal with this mess on their own, but staying and helping them proves something important, not just to them, but to myself. Sarah understood what he meant. Daniel had proven that he was the man she had always known him to be, someone who chose to help others not because of what he could gain from them, but because it was the right thing to do. The legal battles surrounding Robert's case and the construction company's bankruptcy continued for months. Daniel navigated each new development with skill and patience, protecting the family's interests whenever possible while managing their expectations about what could be salvaged from the wreckage. One particularly challenging situation arose when the federal prosecutors decided to investigate whether Catherine had knowledge of her husband's criminal activities. The possibility that she might face charges herself sent the family into panic, but Daniel immediately began building her defense. Mom would never have been involved in Dad's business decisions, Elena protested during a family meeting at Daniel's office. Of course not, Daniel agreed, but we need to be prepared to prove that. The government sometimes casts a wide net when they're looking for co-conspirators. He spent weeks preparing Catherine for potential questioning by federal investigators, coaching her on how to answer questions truthfully while protecting herself legally. His patience and thoroughness during this process impressed even Sarah, who thought she knew the full extent of her husband's dedication. When Catherine was eventually interviewed by the FBI, Daniel was by her side throughout the 4-hour session. His careful preparation paid off. The investigators concluded that she had no knowledge of the illegal activities and dropped any consideration of charges against her. "I don't know how to thank you," Catherine told Daniel afterward, tears streaming down her face. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "Your family." It was a simple statement, but it carried profound meaning. After years of being treated as an outsider, Daniel was claiming his place in the Mitchell family, not through marriage or legal obligation, but through his actions and his character. The process of rebuilding began slowly. Robert was released from federal prison after serving 18 months of his 2-year sentence, his good behavior and cooperation with investigators earning him early release. He emerged from incarceration a humbled man, grateful for the family that had stood by him, and especially grateful for the son-in-law who had saved them all. The construction business was gone forever, liquidated to pay creditors and civil settlements. But Robert, at 64, found work as a project manager for a smaller construction firm, using his decades of experience in a more modest role. The salary was a fraction of what he had once earned, but it provided dignity and purpose. Catherine adapted to her new circumstances with surprising resilience. The woman who had once defined herself through her husband's success and her family's social status discovered that she was capable of much more than she had ever imagined. Her job at the dental office led to additional responsibilities, and eventually she became the office manager, earning the respect of her colleagues through hard work and competence. Marcus found fulfillment in his nonprofit work that he had never experienced in his sales career. His legal troubles had forced him to confront his own values and priorities, leading him to choose meaningful work over financial gain. His family adapted to their more modest lifestyle, and his children actually seemed happier in their smaller house and public schools than they had been in their previous privileged circumstances. Elena eventually returned to school, pursuing her master's degree part-time while working and raising her children. The process took longer than she had originally planned, but she discovered that she appreciated her education more when she was working for it herself, rather than having it handed to her. And Sarah continued her work in social services, finding even more meaning in helping families navigate crises now that she had experienced family crisis herself. Her work had always been important to her, but her family's struggles had given her new empathy for the challenges faced by the people she served. The Mitchell family's story could have ended in bitterness and division. Robert's crimes had cost them their wealth, their social standing, and years of stability. The stress of legal battles and financial ruin could have torn them apart, leaving each family member to struggle alone. Instead, they had been held together by the very man they had once tried to push away. Daniel's expertise had saved them from even worse consequences, but more importantly, his character had shown them what really mattered in life. He had demonstrated that love and loyalty were more valuable than money, that integrity was more important than social status, and that a person's worth couldn't be measured by their income or their background. The vindication Sarah had longed for had finally come, but not in the way she had expected. She had wanted her family to recognize Daniel's worth and treat him with respect. Instead, they had learned to recognize their own failings and appreciate what they had almost lost through their prejudice and short-sightedness. 2 years after Robert's release from prison, the Mitchell family gathered for Thanksgiving dinner at Daniel and Sarah's house. It had become a tradition born of necessity. Their house was still the only one large enough to accommodate everyone comfortably, but it had evolved into something meaningful. The meal was simple compared to the elaborate spreads Catherine had once prepared in her grand dining room. Daniel had prepared the turkey, Sarah had made stuffing and vegetables, and each family member had contributed a dish. But the conversation was richer and more genuine than any they had shared during the years of wealth and pretense. Robert raised his glass of modestly priced wine and looked around the table at his family. "I want to say something," he began, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion. 3 years ago, I was sitting in a federal prison cell, wondering if I'd destroyed everything that mattered to me. I thought I'd lost my business, my reputation, my family's future." He paused, looking directly at Daniel. "But I learned something important during that time. I hadn't lost the things that really mattered, Because the things that really matter can't be taken away by prosecutors or bankruptcy courts or anyone else. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as her father continued. What matters is family. What matters is love. What matters is having people in your life who will stand by you even when you don't deserve it. He raised his glass higher. Daniel, you saved our family in every way that matters. Not just legally, but emotionally and spiritually too. I'm proud to call you my son. Daniel accepted the toast with characteristic grace, but Sarah could see the emotion in his eyes. After years of being treated as an outsider, he was finally being welcomed not just into the family, but into the heart of it. As the evening continued, Sarah reflected on the journey they had all traveled. Her family's wealth was gone, their social status diminished, their comfortable assumptions about life shattered. But they were closer now than they had ever been during the years of prosperity. Daniel had been vindicated completely, but the victory was bittersweet. He had proven his worth beyond any doubt, but the proof had come at enormous cost to the people Sarah loved. The man who had been accused of being after her money had ended up costing himself thousands of hours and tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees to save a family that had rejected him. Later that evening, as they cleaned up after the dinner, Sarah found herself alone with Daniel in the kitchen. "Are you happy?" she asked him as they worked side by side washing dishes. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. "I'm content," he said finally. "Your family has been through hell, but they've come through it as better people. And we've come through it stronger too." Sarah nodded, understanding what he meant. Their marriage had been tested by family crisis, financial stress, and the enormous demands of Daniel's legal work on her family's behalf. But they had emerged from the crucible with a deeper appreciation for each other and for what they had built together. "Do you think things would have been different if my family had accepted you from the beginning?" she asked. Daniel dried a plate thoughtfully before answering. "Maybe, but then we would never have known for certain what we were really made of."
Crisis has a way of revealing people's true character. Yours, mine, your family's. He was right, Sarah realized. The years of struggle had stripped away pretenses and forced everyone to confront their real priorities. Her family had learned that social status and wealth were poor substitutes for genuine relationships. She and Daniel had discovered that their love could withstand any external pressure, and Daniel himself had proven something that went beyond professional competence or personal integrity. He had shown that he was capable of extraordinary forgiveness and generosity of spirit. A lesser man might have abandoned the family that had rejected him, or helped them grudgingly while holding on to resentment. Daniel had chosen a different path. As they finished cleaning up and prepared for bed, Sarah thought about the future. Her family's financial recovery would take years, if it happened at all. Robert would probably never again achieve the level of business success he had once enjoyed. Catherine would continue working well past the age when she had expected to be enjoying comfortable retirement. Marcus and Elena would build their lives more carefully this time, with less emphasis on appearances and more focus on substance. They would teach their children different values than the ones they had grown up with, values about work and character and the importance of treating people fairly regardless of their background. And Sarah and Daniel would continue their life together, strengthened by the trials they had faced and the knowledge that their partnership could withstand anything. They had built something real and lasting, something that couldn't be destroyed by financial ruin or family drama or social disapproval. The vindication Sarah had sought for years was complete, but it looked nothing like what she had imagined. She had wanted her family to recognize Daniel's worth so they would treat him better. Instead, they had learned to recognize their own worth as human beings, independent of wealth or status or social connections. The journey had been painful for everyone involved, but it had also been transformative. The Mitchell family that emerged from their trials was smaller, poorer, and less influential than the one that had entered them, but it was also more honest, more connected, and more resilient. And at the center of it all was Daniel Rodriguez, the man who had been dismissed as a fortune hunter and had proven himself to be exactly what Sarah had always known he was, a person of extraordinary character who chose love over convenience, forgiveness over revenge, and service over self-interest. As Sarah lay in bed that night, listening to Daniel's steady breathing beside her, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. The battles were over, the vindication complete, the future uncertain but hopeful. Her family had learned what she had known all along, that Daniel was worth more than all their lost wealth combined. The man they had accused of being after her money had ended up giving them something far more valuable than money. He had given them a second chance at being the kind of family they should have been all along. 5 years had passed since Robert Mitchell's release from federal prison, and the family had settled into their new reality with a resilience that surprised everyone, including themselves. Sarah stood in the kitchen of the house she and Daniel had purchased 2 years earlier, watching through the window as her husband taught her nephew how to throw a football in their backyard. The house was larger than their previous home, though still modest by Mitchell family standards from the old days. They had been able to afford the upgrade because Daniel's law practice had grown significantly. Word of his skillful handling of the Mitchell family cases had spread throughout Chicago's legal community, bringing him more clients and more complex cases. But success hadn't changed Daniel's fundamental character. He still took pro bono cases for families who couldn't afford legal representation. He still worked reasonable hours and came home for dinner every night. He still planted tomatoes in their garden each spring and spent Saturday mornings fixing things around the house. The biggest change in their lives had come 18 months earlier, when Sarah gave birth to their daughter Maya. The little girl with Daniel's dark eyes and Sarah's stubborn chin had completed their family in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. More importantly, Maya's arrival had given the entire Mitchell clan something joyful to focus on after years of crisis and struggle. Catherine arrived for her weekly Sunday dinner, carrying a bag of toys she had purchased at the discount store where she now worked part-time. At 63, she had transitioned from receptionist to store associate, and while the work wasn't glamorous, she had found dignity in earning her own way. "Where's my grandbaby?" she called out as she entered through the kitchen door. Sarah smiled, gesturing toward the living room where Maya was napping in her crib. "She just went down, so you have about 30 minutes before she wakes up demanding attention." Catherine had transformed into a devoted grandmother, spending every weekend helping Sarah and Daniel with childcare. The woman who had once been too proud to acknowledge financial limitations now clipped coupons and hunted for bargains with enthusiasm. Marcus arrived next with his family, his 2 children racing into the backyard to join their Uncle Daniel and cousin in the football game. His wife Lisa looked healthier and happier than she had during their years of financial stress. Marcus's decision to stay in nonprofit work had meant continued financial challenges, but it had also brought a sense of purpose that his previous career had never provided. "How's the new program coming along?" Sarah asked, as Marcus helped himself to coffee. "Better than expected," he replied. "We're actually getting some funding from the state to expand our services to 3 more counties. It's not going to make us rich, but it's going to help a lot of families get access to healthcare." Elena was the last to arrive, carrying her 3-year-old son while her husband managed their infant daughter. She looked tired but content, having completed her master's degree the previous year while working and raising 2 small children. Her thesis on community-based art programs for low-income families had earned recognition from her professors and had led to a position with a cultural nonprofit. "Sorry we're late," she said, settling her baby into a portable crib they kept at the house for family gatherings. Someone decided nap time was optional today. Robert emerged from the backyard, grass stains on his knees from playing with his grandchildren. At 69, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his eyes held a contentment that had been absent during his years of business success. His job as a project manager had evolved into part-time consulting work that allowed him more flexibility to spend time with family. "Daniel's teaching Tommy to throw a spiral," he announced to the group. "Kid's got a good arm." The casual way Robert spoke about Daniel, the obvious affection in his voice, still struck Sarah as remarkable. The transformation in their relationship had been so complete that it was sometimes hard to remember the years of tension and disapproval. They gathered around the dining room table that Daniel had built himself from reclaimed wood, a project that had taken him months of weekends to complete. The conversation flowed easily, covering everything from local politics to the children's school activities to Catherine's latest adventures in retail work. But the most significant conversation began when Robert cleared his throat and looked around the table with uncharacteristic solemnity. "I have something I need to tell everyone," he began. "I've been meeting with a documentary film firm who wants to tell our story." The table fell silent. Sarah felt Daniel tense beside her. "What kind of documentary?" Elena asked carefully. The kind that explores white-collar crime and its impact on families, Robert replied. She's already interviewed several other families who went through similar situations. She thinks our story is unique because of how we came through it. Marcus leaned forward. What would that involve exactly? Interviews with all of us, if we're willing, access to legal documents, financial records, that sort of thing. She wants to show not just the downfall, but the recovery process. Sarah looked at Daniel, trying to read his expression. She knew this request put him in a difficult position. His legal career depended on client confidentiality and professional discretion. Being featured in a documentary about a high-profile criminal case could have unpredictable consequences. What do you think, Daniel? Catherine asked, her voice showing genuine interest in his opinion. Would something like this hurt your practice? Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. It might actually help in some ways. A lot of potential clients are dealing with family crises that go beyond just legal issues. Seeing how we handled everything might give them confidence that complex problems can be resolved.
But there are risks too, Sarah added, understanding the unspoken concerns. Once our story is public, it's public forever. That's true, Robert acknowledged, but I keep thinking about all the families going through what we went through. Maybe our story could help them understand that it's possible to survive and rebuild. Elena nodded slowly. It might also help other families recognize warning signs earlier. If Dad's business practices had been questioned sooner, maybe the damage wouldn't have been as severe. The conversation continued for over an hour, with each family member weighing the potential benefits and drawbacks of participating in the documentary. Sarah found herself thinking about the broader implications of sharing their story publicly. I think we should do it, she said finally, not because I want attention or sympathy, but because there's something important in what we learned about family, about what really matters, about how people can change and grow. Daniel reached for her hand under the table. If we do this, we need to be completely honest. No sanitizing the hard parts, no making anyone look better than they were. Especially not me, Robert said firmly. I made serious mistakes that hurt a lot of people. If our story is going to help anyone, it has to include the full truth about that. Over the following weeks, each family member made their decision about participating in the documentary. In the end, everyone agreed to be interviewed, understanding that their story might help other families navigate similar crises. The filmmaker, Maria Santos, proved to be thoughtful and respectful in her approach. She spent hours with each family member, exploring not just the facts of what had happened, but the emotions and relationships that had shaped their journey. Sarah's interview took place in the living room, where Maya played quietly with her toys. Maria asked probing questions about the years when her family had rejected Daniel, about the pain of being caught between the man she loved and the family she had grown up with. Looking back, do you think your family's initial reaction to Daniel was understandable? Maria asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. I think it was human. They were protective of me, and they made assumptions based on limited information. But understandable doesn't mean acceptable. They should have given him a chance to prove himself on his own merits. When did you know for certain that you had chosen the right partner? I always knew, Sarah replied, but I think the moment that crystallized it for everyone else was when Daniel could have walked away from our family's problems and chose instead to dedicate himself completely to helping us. That's when it became impossible to question his character or his motives. Daniel's interview was conducted in his law office, surrounded by the case files and legal books that represented his professional life. Maria pressed him about the emotional toll of being rejected by his wife's family while simultaneously building a life with her. Did you ever consider that they might be right about your motives? She asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I think anyone in my position would have moments of self-doubt. When you're constantly being told that you're not good enough, that your motives are suspect, it's natural to question yourself. But I knew why I married Sarah, and it had nothing to do with her family's money. How did their attitude toward you affect your marriage? It created stress, certainly. Sarah was torn between defending me and maintaining her relationship with her family.
But in some ways, the external pressure actually strengthened our bond. We had to depend on each other completely. Do you feel vindicated now? Daniel smiled slightly. Vindication suggests I was fighting to prove something. I wasn't. I was just living my life and trying to be the best husband and son-in-law I could be. The proof of who I am came through my actions, not through arguments or justifications. Robert's interview was perhaps the most emotionally difficult. Maria asked him to confront not just his criminal actions, but his treatment of Daniel and the assumptions that had guided his thinking for years. "When you first met Daniel, what went through your mind?" she asked. "Honestly, I thought he was after Sarah's money. He was older than her, from a different background, working in what I saw as a low-prestige job. All my prejudices kicked in immediately." What would you say to other parents who might have similar reactions to their children's partners? Robert's voice was heavy with regret. "I'd tell them to look past their assumptions and see the person. Daniel saved our family, but more than that, he's been the best thing that ever happened to Sarah. I nearly cost her that relationship because of my own narrow-mindedness." Catherine's interview revealed the depth of her transformation from pampered society wife to working grandmother. She spoke candidly about her initial fears about Daniel and her gradual recognition of his worth. "The turning point for me was watching him with Maya," she admitted. "Seeing how gentle and patient he was with our granddaughter, how naturally he took to fatherhood. You can't fake that kind of goodness." Marcus and Elena both spoke about the lessons they had learned from watching their parents' mistakes and Daniel's response to them. Marcus talked about how the family crisis had changed his own priorities and career choices. Elena discussed how Daniel's example had influenced her approach to her own marriage and family life. The documentary process took 8 months to complete. When Maria showed them the rough cut, Sarah was struck by how clearly the story emerged from their individual interviews. The narrative arc was unmistakable: prejudice, crisis, redemption, and ultimately a deeper understanding of what family really meant. But the most powerful moments in the film were the quiet ones. Daniel teaching Maya to walk while Robert watched with obvious pride. Catherine and Sarah cooking dinner together, their conversation easy and natural. Marcus and Elena discussing their children's futures with hope rather than anxiety. "I think you've captured something important," Daniel told Maria after viewing the rough cut. "This isn't just about our family. It's about how people can change and grow when they're forced to confront their assumptions." The documentary premiered at a small film festival in Chicago, with the entire Mitchell family in attendance. Sarah held Daniel's hand as they watched their story unfold on screen, seeing their journey through an outsider's perspective for the first time. The audience's reaction was overwhelmingly positive. During the question and answer session afterward, several people shared their own stories of family conflict and reconciliation. A woman in her 40s talked about her own struggles with her parents' disapproval of her husband. A young man described his difficulty fitting into his wife's wealthy family. "What advice would you give to couples dealing with family rejection?" one person asked. Sarah looked at Daniel before answering. "Stay true to yourselves and to each other. Family approval is wonderful when you can get it, honestly, but it's not worth compromising your integrity or your relationship." Daniel added, "And remember that people can change. It might take time, it might take crisis, but genuine love and consistent character can eventually overcome prejudice and misunderstanding." The documentary went on to win several awards at film festivals across the country. More importantly, it sparked conversations about class prejudice, family dynamics, and the true meaning of success. Sarah received letters from viewers who said the film had helped them navigate their own family conflicts. But the real measure of the documentary's impact was much more personal. 6 months after its release, Sarah was pushing Maya in her stroller through Lincoln Park when a woman approached her. "Excuse me, are you Sarah from the documentary about the Mitchell family?" the woman asked. Sarah nodded, prepared for the usual comments about the film. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman continued. "My parents have been giving my boyfriend a hard time because he doesn't make much money. After watching your story, I finally understood that I needed to stand up for him more clearly. We're getting married next month, and my parents are actually starting to come around." It was one of dozens of similar encounters Sarah had experienced since the film's release. Their story had resonated with people dealing with similar challenges, offering hope that love and persistence could overcome family prejudice. On a warm evening in late summer, the Mitchell family gathered in Daniel and Sarah's backyard for a barbecue. Maya, now walking confidently, toddled between her grandfather's legs while he tended the grill. Catherine was helping Elena set up a high chair for her newest granddaughter. Marcus was teaching his older children how to play cornhole. Sarah watched the scene from the kitchen window, marveling at how natural and easy it all seemed now. The tensions that had once made family gatherings stressful were gone, replaced by genuine affection and mutual respect. Daniel joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. "I'm thinking about how different this is from those early family dinners when everyone was so polite and uncomfortable." "Better different or just different?" Sarah leaned back against him. "Definitely better. We're all more honest now, more real." They watched Robert lift Maya onto his shoulders, both of them laughing at something only they understood. The sight of her father, who had once questioned Daniel's worthiness, now clearly adoring Daniel's daughter, was still somewhat surreal to Sarah. "Do you think he would have come around eventually, even without the legal crisis?" she asked. Daniel considered the question. "Maybe, but crisis has a way of clarifying what really matters. Your family might have continued their polite disapproval indefinitely if circumstances hadn't forced them to see who I really was. And now? Now we're just family, no qualifiers, no conditions, just people who care about each other and want the best for each other." Later that evening, after the dishes were washed and the children had been put to bed, Robert approached Daniel privately. They had developed a habit of having quiet conversations during family gatherings, the older man seeking advice and perspective from the son-in-law he had once dismissed. "I've been thinking about something," Robert began, as they sat on the back porch, watching fireflies begin to emerge in the gathering darkness. "What's that?" "I keep wondering if I would have been strong enough to do what you did, if our positions had been reversed. If my family had treated you the way we treated you, but you still needed help, would I have been generous enough to provide it?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I think you would have. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. People are capable of more generosity than they realize when the stakes are high enough." "I'm not sure," Robert said honestly. "I held on to grudges for years. I let pride and prejudice guide my decisions. It took losing everything to teach me what really mattered. But you did learn. That's what counts." Robert nodded, then looked directly at Daniel. "I need you to know that my respect for you has nothing to do with gratitude for what you did for our family. I mean, I am grateful, but that's not why I respect you." "Why then?" "Because you're a good man who makes good choices consistently, even when those choices cost you something. That's rare, and it's valuable, and I'm ashamed it took me so long to see it." The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from Maya's development to Marcus's career to Elena's plans for her family. But underlying it all was the comfortable relationship that had developed between two men who had once viewed each other with suspicion and distrust. As the evening wound down and family members began to leave, Sarah reflected on the journey they had all traveled. The documentary had captured their story accurately, but living through the changes had been more gradual and complex than any film could portray. The vindication she had once desperately wanted for Daniel had come, but it had arrived through suffering and loss rather than triumph. Her family had learned to value him not because he was successful or charming or well-connected, but because he was fundamentally decent and reliable when it mattered most. More importantly, the family that had emerged from their trials was healthier and more authentic than the one that had entered them. They had learned to value character over status, substance over appearance, loyalty over convenience. Maya began to fuss, and Daniel immediately went to comfort her. Sarah watched him rock their daughter gently, singing softly in Spanish as he had since she was born. The sight filled her with contentment and gratitude for the life they had built together. "You know what the best part of all this is?" she said to Daniel as he settled Maya back into her crib. "What's that?" "Maya's going to grow up knowing that love and character matter more than money or status. She'll see how her grandfather learned to value the right things, how her grandparents and aunts and uncles all chose family over pride." Daniel smiled. She'll also grow up knowing that her parents chose each other over everyone else's expectations. That might be the most important lesson of all. As they prepared for bed, Sarah thought about the young woman she had been when she first met Daniel, torn between love and family loyalty. That woman couldn't have imagined the journey they would take or the family they would become. But she also couldn't have imagined the depth of satisfaction that came from being proven right about the man she had chosen to love. Not right in a petty or vindictive way, but right in the way that mattered most. Daniel had become exactly the partner, father, and son-in-law she had always known he could be. The story that had begun with family rejection and suspicion had ended with integration and respect. The man who had been accused of being a fortune hunter had proven himself to be the family's greatest treasure. And the vindication that Sarah had sought for years had arrived not through argument or persuasion, but through the simple power of living with integrity and choosing love over convenience at every crucial moment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.